There are creatures out there that want to kill you. And then there are creatures that want something worse. They want to embarrass you. They want to trick you. They want to let you think you won right before they make you look like an idiot. And no, I'm not talking about the opposite sex. I'm talking about the danger of the leprechaun. It's not claws. It's not fangs. It's not some giant monster charging out of the woods. It's just a tiny old man in the dark, tapping at his shoe, smiling while you ruin yourself. Because the real leprechaun of Irish folklore is not the happy little cereal mascot most of us grew up with. He's older than that. He's stranger than that. He's meaner than that. He comes from the Irish otherworld, a place of fairy forts, ancient mounds, missing children, bad luck, whispered names, and things people were afraid to offend. Irish folklore treated that parallel fairy world as real, dangerous, and close, with beings tied to wraths, fairy mounds, and other charged places in the landscape. He's a solitary fairy, a shoemaker, a cobbler, a keeper of hidden treasure, a liar. And if the old stories are to be believed, once he notices you, your luck has already ran out. Welcome back, everybody, to Gravely Amusing, the only horror history podcast that has no idea why people keep asking me if I'm getting lucky tonight. I mean, I know it's St. Patrick's Day, but I'm not a lucky man, and I don't know why they keep asking that. I don't know. Anyway, it has been a minute. It's been a long time since I've talked to you listeners. And, life happens, school happens, depression happens, but I'm back and I'm here. And I knew that for me to come back, I wanted to come back with something fun, something strange, and something just eerie enough to feel like home. And what better topic for St. Patrick's Day than a creature everybody thinks they kind of understand, but nobody really does. And that creature is the leprechaun. Now, when most people hear lucky leprechaun, they probably picture that amazing commercial with the little cartoon leprechaun going, "Oh, I'm a leprechaun, you don't get my lucky charms." And there's always little tiny marshmallows just stuck right in the cereal. And when you eat it, you're like, "Oh, this is candy, I'm having fun." Or they picture a tiny Irish man in green with a red beard, a buckled hat, and a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. But that image is late. The older folklore of leprechauns is much stranger than that. It's much darker than that. And honestly, it's way more interesting. In the traditional record, the leprechaun is not a cheerful mascot. He's actually a solitary fairy. He's usually male, he's usually old, often a shoemaker or a cobbler, and almost always a trickster. If you catch him, he may reveal his treasure, but only if you never look away. Baby, look away. And if we meet on the street someday, and I don't know what to say, look away, baby, look away. Don't look at me. I don't want you to see me this way. You know you're going to get a concert tonight, but here we are. And of course, in these stories of the leprechaun, people always look away. Tonight, I want to tell you the story of leprechauns, not the cereal box version, the full story, where they seem to come from, the fairy world that they belong to, the earliest tales that connect to them, what they're supposed to look like, what powers they got, whether there are female leprechauns, why gold became part of the myth, why St. Patrick's Day absorbed them, and how America helped turn an eerie little supernatural cobbler into one of the most recognizable symbols of Irishness on Earth. So let's get to it. The leprechaun actually doesn't start with gold, it doesn't start with rainbows, not even with green. It actually starts with the other world. One of the biggest mistakes modern people make is hearing the word fairy and imagining sparkles, wings, and Tinkerbell. That's not always the vibe here. To understand leprechauns, we first have to understand the world they come from. Ancient Ireland was steeped in belief in a supernatural realm existing alongside the human one. It's a parallel world of fairy beings, often referred to in Irish tradition as the sea. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It's SI, the sea. And in broader mythological language, connected to the sea is connected to the AOC, the AOSSI, an AOC, a supernatural race of otherworldly beings. The University College of Dublin's folklore material says belief in this fairy world or parallel sphere of existence was extremely strong in Irish folk tradition. And history notes that leprechauns were understood as part of the AOC, or AOC, a supernatural race similar to elves and fairies. These beings were not cute. They were dangerous, unpredictable, powerful, and deeply tied to the land. The sea, or the Sai, the fairy folk, the good people, the people of the hills, were believed to dwell in Leosana, Raths, cairns, forts, and mounds, and to involve themselves in human affairs. Misfortunes, disappearances, calamities at sea, untimely deaths, and even whirlwinds could be blamed on fairy activity in Irish culture. The University College of Dublin also notes a belief that young boys were sometimes dressed in skirts to protect them from fairy abduction. Interesting. That is not whimsical fantasy. That is a worldview where the unseen world is active, touchy, and potentially hostile. And that landscape matters. Burial mounds, fairy forts, standing stones, wells, caves, old thorn trees, lonely roads. In Irish folklore, these are not just scenic details, they're thresholds. The land is inhibited and it remembers things. It has places where the boundary between human life and the other world feels dangerously thin. So when you hear that a leprechaun is a kind of fairy, don't translate that to sweet magical helper. Translate it to small supernatural being from a tradition where contact with the other world can go badly. The leprechaun may be more comic than some of the darker beings in Irish folklore, but he still comes from a system that people historically do not treat as harmless. So I just had to get that out of the way because this is where the creepiness starts. Because now the tapping camera in the woods is not very charming. It's a warning. One of the earliest literary connections to leprechaun like beings comes from an old Irish tale, The Adventure of Fergus, son of Leti, or Leti, or Leti. And this is where the story gets really interesting because in this earliest lair, we're not dealing with the full modern leprechaun. There's no little green suit, there's no rainbow, there's no cheerful pot of gold image. What we get here instead are small supernatural beings actually tied to water. So in the tale, Fergus, a king of Ulster, falls asleep near the shore. And while he sleeps, tiny beings, often linked to the old term Locorpain, that's Luchorpain, or little bite sprites, seize him and begin dragging him toward the sea. He wakes when the cold water touches him, and before these sprites can escape, he grabs three of them. That detail matters that he grabbed three of them. He catches them because, the shock in the water wakes him to seize him. And the story takes on an older folkloric shape here of capture, bargaining with the creature, and then release. Very common trope in folklore where people capture a being, they bargain with it, and then they release that being. The little beings, the three little beings, beg for mercy, and in exchange for freedom, they agree to grant Fergus supernatural favors or three wishes, depending on whatever version is summarized in this folklore tale. Now, that is wild because it means one of the oldest layers of leprechaun tradition is not about a shoe repairing gold hoarder under a hedge. It's about a small, dangerous, water associated supernatural being who can drag a sleeping king toward the sea and bargain for their lives when caught. In other words, the earliest leprechaun like creatures were not really symbols of luck. They were creatures of capture, bargaining, and danger. And then there's the name itself. So, for a long time, the standard explanation linked leprechaun to Irish forms of leprechaun and older forms meaning something like small body. Encyclopedia Britannica still reflects that older line of thinking. In a in a 2019 revision of the Medieval Irish Dictionary, reopened this debate. And reporting on that research said the word may not be native Irish after all. It may instead connect to the Roman Luperci, or Luperci, and the festival of Lupercalia. That doesn't mean that the folklore is Roman or fake when it comes to leprechauns. It means the etymology is more debated and stranger than people assumed. And the old water association in the Fergus story suddenly looks kind of even more interesting. And that's one of my favorite things about folklore because the deeper you dig, the less neat it becomes, where it's not necessarily always Irish or always, medieval folklore. It can be a mixture of this story told orally and mixed around. So right away, the leprechaun is messier than people think because the name is debated. The earliest version is stranger than the later one. And the closer you get to the oldest material, the less this really feels like St. Patrick's Day decoration, and the more it feels like something that wandered in from a much older and much less friendly world for sure. As the folklore develops, the leprechaun becomes a more recognizable figure. A leprechaun is a fairy in the form of a tiny old man, often with a cocked hat and a leather apron, solitary by nature, living in remote places, making shoes and brogues. The sound of his hammering betrays his presence. He possesses a hidden crock of gold, and if captured, he may reveal it, but only as long as his captor never looks away. Look away, baby, look away. Usually the human does look away and the fairy vanishes. That shoemaker detail is not random. It's one of the most consistent parts of the traditional leprechauns. The Irish Schools collection repeatedly describes leprechauns as little men heard hammering at shoes or boots in lonely places. One entry says the leprechaun is about 2 feet high. He wears a red coat and green breeches, is usually a cobbler, and may be sitting under a mushroom making boots. Other records, the tipped other and other records say there's a tip tap of a leprechaun working on a pair of small boots in a field at night. So basically, if you hear that sound of a tiny hammer wherever you are, there is a leprechaun deal. In folklore, leprechauns are often heard before they're seen. That tiny hammering sound I'm talking about, that little tip tap in the dark, is almost like the leprechaun's signature. It tells you that something from the fairy world is close, but not close in a good way. This sound is not an invitation, it is baked. Now, why shoes? Why shoes? Nobody can prove it for certain, but there are a couple of good folklore level explanations. One is that leprechauns mend shoes for the larger fairy host. the other beings of the other world who dance, travel, and wear their footwear out. Another simpler, shoemaking is a solitary trade, and leprechauns are very solitary beings. They're not usually described as part of fairy crowds. Instead, they're loners. They're tacked away in remote places, doing private little trade with a private little grudge against human greed. They are solitary by nature, is one of the most important clues to their mythology. And that solitary part matters because the leprechaun isn't just a fairy. He's a special kind of fairy, a loner, a tradesman, a hidden wealth guardian, and a creature that seems to enjoy making humans feel dumb. Now, let's get another myth out of the way here too. Leprechauns were not always green. The modern image says that they have a green suit, they got a green hat, they got, green socks, green Stanley Cup with them, green underwear, green poop, whatever. But the older evidence says that's not the case. This, the old collections describe leprechauns in red coats, red caps, sometimes green caps, white breeches, silver buckles. They had mostly a mixed color clothing of red, green, and white. One account gives him a red coat and green breeches. Another says he wore a red jacket with swallowtails and a red cap. History also notes older descriptions, including like a little red nightcap, not this all standard green costume. The size of leprechauns varies too in stories. Some sources make them around 2 or 3 feet tall. Others make them much smaller, 6 inches or so. But the overall picture is steady. It's small, male looking, old looking, bearded, and dressed more like a weird little tradesman than some beautiful fairy prince. One thing I also like about the older descriptions is how inconsistent they are, but in the right way. Some stories make the leprechauns about knee high off a June bug. Some shrink him down to just a few inches. Some dress him mostly in red. Some give him mixed colors. And that inconsistency is not a weakness. That is like folklore doing what folklore does. It shifts just enough from place to place that the creature actually feels alive. The all green version is what happens later when advertising, pop culture, and natural imagery flatten a weird old folk being into like one standard picture. I remember when I was a kid in preschool during St. Patrick's Day, when we were taking our naps for the day, which I think should be a mandatory thing in every part of the workplace. Like even if you work in a restaurant, just shut the restaurant down and everybody takes a nap. Just my opinion. But I remember like waking up from a nap in preschool when I was like 4 or 5 years old, and the teachers being like, "Oh, a leprechaun! This is oh, a leprechaun!" And there was these little tiny footprints of green paint just all over like the tile floor leading into like the kitchen and the art room of the preschool. And we had to follow these footprints because the leprechaun was there while we were sleeping and try to find the pot of gold. And I think the pot of gold was just like those little chocolates that were covered in gold aluminum foil to look like coins. I don't know, those were good. Those were fun times. And I really liked nap time because I never had this stage in my life where I had cutie or I thought women had cuties or I didn't like girls. Like I liked them from the get go, and I probably get that from my father. But I I don't remember what her name was, but I remember being like 4 years old, and there was this preschool teacher that would like all the boys wanted her to rub our backs and help us fall asleep because she was, like, really pretty. I don't know, and, 35 years later, I still got it with the ladies, I guess. But anywho, I don't know why I shared that story. Oh, yeah, 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 because, a lot of people ask about female leprechauns, and this is one of the places where the honest answer is Like, there's no real mainstream record about female leprechauns. And History's Overview and Encyclopedia Britannica and Irish Schools Collection, anything that I couldn't find anything about female leprechauns. Leprechauns are consistently presented as little men or tiny old men. And that doesn't mean that fiction hasn't invited female leprechauns. It just means that the traditional record, they're not a major part of mythology. The old folklore overwhelmingly leads them to be male. So he's a solitary guy that decided not to get married. Good for him. Proud of him. And he's not a smiling green mascot. He's a tiny old red capped cobbler under a hedge, mending his shoe in the dark. That's a leprechaun. So what powers do leprechauns have? What can they do? Well, this is where people tend to oversell things. Leprechauns are not usually magical in the modern fantasy sense. They're not hurling fire or summoning storms. They're much more subtler. And honestly, it's a little bit more interesting. So the first power they have is evasion. So if you catch one, you had to keep your eyes on him the whole time. You can't blink. Blink and you're dead. But the second your attention breaks, he's gone. And that pattern is right there and echoes through all folklore. The leprechaun's strength is not brute force, it's his ability to distract you. So I've been told that I am amazing at staring contests. There is a shout out to my coworker Anna here. She thinks that I'm probably a mutant and my mutant power is that I can win any staring contest. I don't blink, I don't lose focus. I am on it. Mostly to creep people out. But I probably could go one on one with a leprechaun. I could use the money. But that's his main power. Don't look away. Baby, look away from a leprechaun. And the second power is hidden knowledge. Leprechauns know where the gold is, or where their treasure is buried, or where old wealth lies hidden in lonely places. In later literary folklore, they're described as having grown rich from treasure crocks buried long ago. That gives the gold a believable folkloric logic. War leaves behind buried wealth, sunken ships, people they've tricked before that have died and maybe had money. They just keep gaining more wealth as time passes. And they know where ruins are. They know where, lonely fields and forgotten grounds. They know where lost things are, which become makes them become like a supernatural keeper. The third power that they have is trickster intelligence. And this is a big one. Leprechauns do not usually overpower people at all. They outplay them. They lie, they distract, they misdirect, they mislead, or technically tell the truth in the most useless way possible. The human being eventually really defeats themselves. And that's the real leprechaun's power, the ability to make you not think straight, to distract you, and mess with your mind. And in the earliest Fergus material, there is one ability in the background, which is supernatural bargaining. The tiny beings in that tale can be forced into granting favors or wishes in exchange for a release if they're captured. So, across this whole tradition, the leprechaun's power set is basically this: it's evasion, hidden treasure knowledge, they know where things are hiding, they have uncanny mobility, and the ability to bargain from the edge of the supernatural world. So, why do these leprechauns even have gold? Like, where does this come from? This is one of the most famous parts in mythology, but it's also one of the most misunderstood. So, yes, the gold is real folklore. They say that the leprechaun possesses a hidden crock of gold, and older stories absolutely do focus on people trying to force him to reveal it. But history points out something really important. The giant pop culture obsession with pots of gold and lucky abundance becomes much bigger later as the leprechaun's image softens through time and becomes more playful. So in other words, the gold is traditional, but the full rainbow commercial version is later polishing of the myth. The older folkloric explanation is more interesting. The leprechaun is not just some tiny magical banker printing coins. He's imagined as the supernatural keeper of wealth that is left behind, hidden, buried, or lost. That makes the gold feel less cartoon luck and more like something eerie. Forgotten human wealth is lonely ground, now guarded by a being who belongs to the other world. So, and honestly, the treasure kind of works symbolically too. The leprechaun's gold is almost always yours. You think you found the shortcut. You think you beat the universe. You think you finally got your hands on his hidden thing, and then it slips away. And this is not just a creature, it's like a worldview. A leprechaun symbols the leprechaun symbolizes basically all the stuff that you want, all the stuff that you think you deserve, and the stuff you'll never get because either you're stupid or something is outsmarting you to get there. It's basically similarly symbolic Simba Simba. I am your father. Symbolic to all the things that we want in life and all the dreams we have and how that might never happen. So, and like this is the part I think people miss when they only know the mascot. Leprechaun stories are not really wish fulfillment stories. They're more so humiliation stories. They're about greed making people stupid. So maybe not necessarily full greed, but just wanting things that you can't have and making you feel stupid for it. And I think people can relate to that. So, and the leprechaun stories are about human beings thinking that they can outsmart the supernatural world and finding out very quickly that they can't. The leprechaun usually wins not because he's stronger than you, but because he understands something you don't. Once greed takes over you, you actually start helping him trick you because you're overcome with greed. And if you want the real folklore personality of the leprechaun, this could tell you pretty much anything. In one Irish school's collection tale, a little boy catches a leprechaun who tells him the gold is hidden under a thistle in a field. The boy ties a scarlet garter to the thistle so he can come back with a spade. When he returns, the leprechaun is gone, and every thistle in the field has now a scarlet ribbon tied to it. So, this is classic leprechaun logic. He doesn't usually overpower you with brute force, he lets your own greed and confidence ruin you. In another story, a poor old woman catches a little man in a red jacket hammering a shoe. She locks him in a chest for 2 days. Eventually, she boils a pot of water and threatens to put him in it unless he reveals where his gold is hidden. He finally tells her it's under an old bush with a wisp of hay near it. She goes to get it and finds many bushes with hay hanging from them. Again, same move. The leprechaun may technically tell the truth, but in the most slippery, evasive, maddening way possible. Another story for you. A man catches a leprechaun, and the little guy tries the classic trick. Look behind you. There's another leprechaun. The man refuses to look. He keeps hold of him until he gets a crock of gold, carries it home, hides it under the bed, and goes to sleep feeling very pleased with himself. In the morning, the gold is gone. All that remains is a crock of leaves. That's one of my favorite leprechaun details. You can get all the way home with the thing, and you can still lose the gold because you took your eyes off of them. One creepy story I got here says a man was out late checking rabbit snares and hears the sound tip tap from a couple of fields away. He follows it and sees a little leprechaun busily making a pair of small boots. He grabs him and demands treasure. The little fellow leads him away, and the man falls for hours. Eventually, he gets tired. He sits down to rest. He falls asleep. and he wakes near a deep well with no sign of the leprechaun at all. He takes 3 days to get home and never again pays attention to the sound of the leprechaun's hammer. And that story is not about luck. It's about being made a fool of something small and ancient that knows the land better than you do. And to me, that is the real leprechaun. Not a lucky charm, just a little supernatural con artist. So, for the question everybody asks, are leprechauns real? If you mean real by literal biological, tiny cobbler men hiding gold in the woods of Ireland, there's no scientific evidence for that. Doesn't mean it's not true. But if by real you mean like real folklore, real as belief, real as something that shaped how people thought, feared, and told stories, then yes, absolutely, leprechauns are real. The University of Dublin's Natural Folklore Collection preserves a huge record of Irish supernatural belief, and the material around the other world shows that they are not just abstract stories. People attach them to places, actual misfortunes, actual fears, and actual behavior, and that's real cultural power. And yes, people have claimed to see leprechauns. I mean, I saw one in preschool. Older folklore includes people hearing the hammering, seeing a little cobbler, or recovering some trace after he vanished. And in modern Ireland, Carlingford in County Louth still actually preserves leprechaun lore as part of living folklore and tourism. Discover Ireland's official tourism site promotes the Carlingford Leprechaun and Fairy Cavern and says visitors are greeted by Micolite, Kevin Woods, the Leprechaun Whisperer, who introduces the story of the last leprechauns of Ireland. And that's not scientific proof, it's just proof that the story is still alive. And honestly, that answer is way more interesting than just a yes or no, because folklore doesn't tell us what people claim to see. It tells us what they feared, what they respected, what they warned each other about, what they thought greed looked like, what they believed the land might still be hiding. And maybe that's the best horror story anyway. Not a monster that tears you apart, a monster that lets you ruin yourself. Now, today is St. Patrick's Day, and this is another huge misunderstanding about leprechauns on St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick himself had nothing to do with leprechauns. St. Patrick's Day began in Ireland around the 9th or 10th century as a Christian feast honoring Patrick, the 5th century missionary associated with spreading Christianity in Ireland. History says plainly that many of the parade traditions and public celebration customs people now associate with the holiday developed in North America, not Ireland. So the leprechaun was not originally part of some ancient St. Patrick package. Say that 1,000 times fast. St. Patrick package. St. Patrick's package. St. Patrick's pack. St. Patrick's package. Man, that sounds dirty. I didn't mean it like that. Anyway, the leprechaun got folded into St. Patty's Day much later as the holiday expanded from a feast day into a broader celebration of Irish identity. The same goes for the color green. Like most people assume green and Patrick always went together, but the historical pictures is a bit messier. Green became a stronger symbol of Irish identity over time, especially as Irish nationalism, shamrock imagery, and public celebration all merged together. So once St. Patrick's Day stopped being only a religious observance and became a public display of Irishness, the leprechaun slid naturally into the holiday as a folkloric symbol. And once the leprechaun stopped being just a creature of folklore and started becoming a symbol of Irishness, it was only a matter of time before he got absorbed into the biggest political or biggest biggest public celebration of Irish identity in the world, which is St. Patrick's Day. So it's as simple as this. Leprechauns are not from St. Patrick's Day. They were absorbed into it much later. And at some point, the leprechaun stops being just a story told near the fire and becomes a symbol, mostly because of America. So history traces a big part of the shift of leprechaun story changing through the 19th century and into Irish American identity. As the leprechaun's image softened, newer stories made him less terrifying and more mischievous. Still sly, still tricky, but less sinister, water sprite, and more like a being who outsmarts greedy humans. So by the time Irish immigrant identity was taking shape in the United States, the leprechaun had become tied more and more to Irishness and luck. But there's an uncomfortable edge here too, really. History notes that the modern leprechaun has drifted far from its mythological roots and can function mostly as a stereotype sometimes. Lovable maybe, but also diminished and cartooned. Sometimes pop culture just doesn't adapt folklore, sometimes it domesticates it. It takes a culturally specific, eerie old being and turns him into something safe enough for shot glasses, paper hats, cereal boxes, novelty socks, and, the symbol of Boston Celtics and, the Fighting Irish. And so once America got a hold of the leprechaun, all bets were off here. History points to films like The Luck of the Irish in 1948, Disney's Darby O'Gill and the Little People in 1959, Finian's Rainbow in 1968, like all part of this leprechaun pop culture rise. But then in 1993, it's a good year. 1993 was a good year. Horror dragged the creature back towards something nastier with the Leprechaun franchise, where gold obsessed little monster turns murderous when people steal from him. I love the Leprechaun franchise, and next year I'll probably talk more about it. But the Leprechaun movies, I think they're like what's really great about horror comedies is they don't take themselves seriously. I mean, you have a leprechaun killing some dude with a pogo stick, you know, just trying to get his gold. And it's also Jennifer Aniston's first movie, was 1993's Leprechaun. I think it's a franchise that could be rebooted and done well. I know they tried to reboot it with Leprechaun Origins a few years ago. I think you really could do something well with this, but I'll have to put a script together one day. But if you strip these one-liners from the Leprechaun franchise and Warwick Davis and his little outfit, it's not really far from what folklore told us about the Leprechaun. It's not really that crazy about it. But of course, there's a mascot era when it comes to leprechauns. We have General Mills has Lucky the Leprechaun, and they introduced Lucky the Leprechaun on St. Patrick's Day in 1964 to bring Lucky Charms to market. And by the mid 20th century, the leprechauns were everywhere. I mean, they're cereal, they're children's entertainment, sports branding, as I mentioned, parades, costumes. Basically, leprechauns and St. Patrick's Day go hand in hand. And what you're really seeing is pop culture taming folkloric creatures. First, the leprechaun becomes less threatening, then becomes a representative, then becomes marketable, then he becomes funny. And then horror comes along decades later and says, what if we made him creepy again? And honestly, that's why the horror version works, period, in the Leprechaun movies. Because underneath the jokes and the ridiculous one liners and the pogo sticks on a dude's chest, there's still an old folkloric core there. A supernatural being with a fixation on stolen treasure and a nasty reaction when people think they can take what is his. So the pop culture arc really is incredible. The leprechaun goes from small, dangerous fairy trickster to Irish symbol to breakfast mascot to horror villain, and that's a pretty decent career path. So let's do these myth busting clearly here. Okay. So myth number one about leprechauns. Leprechauns are cute. They're just cute Irish mascots. No, their older folklore gives us solitary tricksters, cobblers, deceivers, and some of the earliest material dangerous water associated beings, like water sprites. Myth number two, they're all about joy and gold. The gold matters, but the stories are usually about humans failing, getting greedy, getting fooled, getting distracted, or ending up with leaves instead of treasure. They weren't always green. Older depictions include red jackets, red caps, mixed colors, white breeches, and not just the standard green costume. And remember, fairies do not mean harmless. In Irish traditions, the fairy world is feared, respected, and tied to abduction, bad luck, calamity, and uncanny interference in human life. And most people think the modern version is the original version. And we know that's not true. So, what is a leprechaun really? A leprechaun is a specifically Irish supernatural figure that grew out of the wider fairy world of Irish traditions. The earliest leprechaun like beings are dangerous little water sprites. And later folklore turns the type into a solitary male fairy shoemaker tied to hidden treasure, sly deception, and lonely fairy haunted places. He's usually old, small, male, and often red capped before he is ever all green. He belongs to the other world. He does not come marching out with fairy armies. He sits alone, he mends shoes, waiting for some human to make a bad decision. So, the real leprechaun is not just Lucky Charms with a pension plan. He is the sound of a tiny hammer in the dark, a little old man in red under a hedge, a fairy who knows where treasure is buried, a liar you must never look away from, a survivor from an old Irish world that did not separate magic from danger. And maybe that's why he's lasted. Because the leprechaun is not really the fantasy of getting rich. He's a warning that wanting too much, too quickly, can make you stupid enough to follow anything, even a tiny voice in the dark. I hope this story horrified you. I hope it terrified you. And if nothing else, I hope it left you gravely amused.